Hey guys, this is Denny.
This is James from TeaDB.org, and we're bringing you a special episode today, episode number 12.
So today we're just going to talk about tea in general and just kind of go back and forth. No real rhyme or reason. We're just going to speak to tea and drink some tea. And just kind of catch up a little bit about what we've been drinking, and I have a couple questions that we can talk to as well. So, but let's just start first off with what we're going to end up drinking here. And I'm going to kind of do this while we're diving deep into it. So we've got some gorgeous Oriental Beauty right here. No idea how much tea leaf that we're using. I just put it into the gaiwan to measure it out, and then I just put it into this cute little serving tray. So we're having maybe 3/4 of the gaiwan full of leaf.
Yep.
We're going to use...
This is a way more standard practice just in terms of how we drink tea. And how most people, once they get experience, do tend to drink tea.
Absolutely. And actually, we'll talk to that. But we're going to use much colder water than typically I would with an oolong. I found this to be really pleasant this way. Oriental Beauty is a really cool, unique tea. And the way that we're brewing now, which is going to be first one quick rinse, and then a pretty short steep time, and then we're going to drink that cup. I'd love just to speak quickly to this tea. So, Oriental Beauty is a really unique tea. It's an oolong tea. It's not rolled, so it's curled or twisted, and it's an interesting tea because its value is prized by the virtue of its processing, and the way that it's processed is very different from the average oolong tea and from most teas in general. So tea is a processed plant, and there are insects and other critters out there that like to eat that plant. And so oftentimes tea is protected, the harvest is protected by using pesticides, like we would with anything else really. But this tea was actually created unintentionally without pesticides. And what had ended up happening was this tea was basically eaten up by crickets initially. And it was in the humid summer, and the tea farmer that... I'm in love with this tea right now, so I can't speak enough about it. But the tea farmer decided, you know what, I'm just going to try to sell this tea anyway. It's been eaten up by crickets a little bit, and it's a summertime tea, but who knows, maybe I can get something like a nice high price out of the market anyway. So, and coincidentally, the tea ended up tasting delicious, and the reason why is because of the crickets biting the leaves. And so what ends up happening is the tea plant responds to the crickets or other insects biting the leaves, and it creates two different chemicals, which I frankly don't know the names of. They're not a common name, but it gives it this really beautiful, sweet kind of mellow, chocolatey taste that is what's famous about Oriental Beauty. Yep.
And the processing for this tea that Denny's been talking about is one of the most unique for any sort of tea. And I don't even know if you mentioned this, but it is a Taiwanese oolong, but it is so different from just about every other Taiwanese or other oolong that you will have.
And so, traditionally, what's the best Taiwanese oolong, right? It's going to be from the spring, high mountains, hard to grow climate, not very humid, right?
From a really famous mountain.
Absolutely. And this is a low elevation summertime tea, and it has to be because that's the only environment that these crickets actually go out and start biting up the tea leaves. So it's a really unique tea in that regard. It's got a cool little history to it. And having researched this tea when I started drinking it, it just kind of reminded me how little I know about tea and how much there is about tea to learn, which is just so exciting. I've been drinking tea for years, getting into it a lot more seriously in the last year or two. And it's just fun to continuously learn about tea.
Yep. And where did we get this tea?
So we found this at Floating Leaves. You guys can check them out, floatingleaves.com. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you know what? I actually haven't been there yet. James had picked this up for me and I just fell in love with it. Started doing some research, and I've been enjoying it. The flavor notes are similar to a Yunnan Black. I actually there's a post on the TeaDB Facebook page, which follow it if you don't, facebook.com/TeaDB. And I thought, having known nothing about this tea and not asking James, I thought it was a Yunnan Black. It looks like a Yunnan Black. It tastes like a Yunnan Black. It has that sweetness and that chocolatey.
Yeah.
And
if you're really used to Taiwanese oolongs, you're used to kind of like the green rolled oolongs that we're all so familiar, or at least we are very familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And this is curled, and I mean, obviously there's more than just rolled oolongs, but it just, in terms of performance, seemed to veer well away from the Taiwanese oolongs.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you're going to get something that's roasted like this, I expect to get those sort of nutty flavors, and it's much more of those kind of caramel, chocolatey flavors.
Yeah, rather than kind of that nuttiness that you get from like a dong ding, for instance.
Mm-hmm. So, this tea is wonderful. Please go ahead and check it out and read about it. And experiment with how you brew it. I would definitely recommend brewing it with colder than you would think water. And I think that ends up creating that really beautiful, sweet mellowness to it.
Yeah. And over the last few days, I've actually experimented with the brewing parameters of this, just because I knew Denny loved the tea so much, and I knew we were going to talk about it. So I tried it with boiled temperatures, or close to boiled, which is normally how I brew my oolongs, and it came out very, very closely to kind of Yunnan black tea, with perhaps a little bit less sweetness to it, but it has that same sort of astringency and bitterness that a Yunnan black would have. And then I brewed it at almost green tea temperatures, maybe slightly above, and it was good, but it lacked a lot of the body that we're getting out of it right now. And so kind of what we settled on and what Denny recommended was a temperature kind of in the middle. And that's where we're brewing it at today.
And I've actually been experimenting with colder than typical oolong temperatures, and I'm enjoying it. So one thing that I've been doing, and kind of just diving into it a little bit with some of the oolong that I've been drinking from Floating Leaves, is varying the amount of water that I'm using a little bit throughout the steeping. So because the leaves are so tightly rolled at first, I actually would use a lot less water in the first steeping or two. And as the leaves expand, I start to slowly fill up the gaiwan with more and more water. And I found that actually it's kind of created a little bit of a more consistent taste throughout. There's reasons to do both, but I've been experimenting with that, and I found it quite nice. And it's also just a little easier on my fingers pouring out the gaiwan all night, and a little bit easier on my stomach in the evening. So
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So one question that I actually haven't really proposed yet to you, James, this is coming off of the cuff for you, but I've been thinking about, is that we have been giving recommendations on the show about how long to brew a certain tea and at what temperature exactly.
Right.
But if you actually think about it, we haven't measured either of those two things scientifically on the show once.
Not necessarily, no.
No, we haven't, really.
Yeah.
I don't know if we have once. We've measured the amount of tea that we've used, and we've been able to keep the temperature pretty consistent. But in terms of how long we're steeping this tea, for instance, right now, or how long we just steeped some of the green tea that we had, while we're recommending something, we're not actually measuring the time.
Yeah, we're doing our best to practice it, but you're correct in the sense that we don't currently have a timer going on telling me, beep, 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 I should be pouring this out right now.
But I remember, months ago, seeing you really getting scientific with measuring the amount of time, the amount of leaves that you're using, and so on with brewing. What would you speak to that? I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so for me, those things were all part of kind of the learning process, and slowly I phased those things out as I believe I can eyeball and just get a better feel for kind of when I should be doing this stuff. And it also, by removing these kind of fallbacks or that tell you exactly when to do something, you're building your innate tea skills a little bit more too. So you can play it more by feel. You'll be like, oh, I'm getting kind of these caramel notes at this lower temperature. If I up the temperature or something like that, you'll get kind of more of that bitterness, that astringency. So just being more aware of that and varying your brewing parameters based off of that. And I find I'm just more aware of those things. now that I'm not using the super strict brewing parameters.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say for people that are just getting into tea, learning the feel of the tea itself is something you should do. There's sort of three elements. I was thinking about this. Three elements to making tea. There is the tea leaves, the hot water, and the person making it. And you can keep those tea leaves, the amount of tea leaves, and the hot water the same, but the person making it is the other element, right? And depending on what you're feeling like tasting in some sense, what you're hoping to get out of the tea, and how you want to experiment with the tea, it's going to taste dramatically different each time. And so I would encourage people that are just trying tea for the first time, loose leaf, high quality tea, to really get a little scientific about it, measure everything.
Yep.
But using that experience, go ahead and depart from that method.
Yep. So once you know what 4 grams looks like for a rolled oolong, you know what 4 grams looks like for a rolled oolong, and you can do that without the aids of a scale.
Right.
And maybe every once now and then you could get a little bit off base, and you'll need to kind of recalibrate your mental scale within your own head. So it's good every now and then to kind of do that old exercise of measuring it out on like a device like this and a miniature scale.
Absolutely. And I find actually that because certain teas if it's an unfamiliar tea that I've never had before, from a new area, I will be very specific about how I brew it.
Definitely.
And really learn how the parameters are that are suggested, do some research. But then I kind of like to experiment. And It's funny to me because I was sort of sitting and thinking, wow, we sit and drink tea all the time, and we make beautiful tasting tea, but we've really departed from what we might necessarily recommend.
Yeah.
So
using those brewing parameters and stuff like that is fantastic to get a baseline, and just like giving you something to fall back on and something to start with. But really, when you start to get into tea more and more, you start responding more to instinct, to flavor, to the way it feels in your mouth. And I think that's natural, and I think you should really embrace that rather than staying super strict to your brewing parameters as you gain more experience.
So another question that that I've sort of been aware of, I suppose, another part of tea brewing is that there's a difference between the leaves at the very top of a bag. Let's say I get 4 ounces of beautiful, fluffy, twisted oolong, and the bottom of the bag, where it's, maybe it's a little bit more crushed, it's a little more powdery.
Definitely.
Especially with something like a pu'er tea. The flavor and the size of the tea leaves themselves change. How do you accommodate for that, James? What do you do?
That's a very good question, and I don't really have a great answer, but I totally notice what you're talking about. For even such teas as like Japanese green teas, where they're going to have some kind of fine leaves, and they're going to have very, very small particles, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And you will get very different flavor profiles, or maybe you may just notice that your strainer is filling up much more quickly with these little particles that are getting through your Kyushu or teapot strainer.
So I raced through this oolong tea, and that might be this Oriental Beauty, and that could be indicative of the taste of it and how much I've enjoyed it. In fact, it totally is. And I also noticed that when I was getting toward the end of my bag, the steepings were getting a lot more bitter, and I realized that it was partially because the leaves themselves were kind of more fine and ground up. So what I would actually recommend for some people to at least experiment with, or be cognizant of, is that at the end of the bag that you have, you might end up getting a little bit more particulate, but that particulate, because it's so small and it has more surface area, if you think about it, especially if it's a rolled oolong, for instance,
that's a good point.
is going to brew a little bit quicker.
Yep.
And you'll have a little bit of a stronger cup.
And that's definitely can be applied directly to pu'er, where this is perhaps even more prevalent, in the sense that you'll be getting, especially if you're breaking off a cake or something like that, and you're using your pick. And so there's a lot of different opinions on what the correct kind of big chunk to small chunk ratio you should do. And I guess the most common one I've heard is kind of a 70-30 ratio of big chunks to small chunks. But what's going to happen is for those larger chunks, is that they're going to give off very little flavor until they're kind of broken apart. So what a lot of people do with pu'er, and this is the reason why you see styles like this, is they're going to use 2 rinses rather than 1 or even 0 that you'll sometimes see for green or white teas. And this is to just kind of break apart those big pieces of pu'er and just allow it to start exerting itself. So a lot of times for pu'er, the first couple steepings, depending on how many big chunks you have, are going to be a little bit weaker than perhaps your 4th or your 5th steeping.
Yeah, especially with pu'er, I totally agree that the big chunks open up dramatically in the 3rd and 4th steeping and account for it, no doubt.
Yep, and the amount of compression in a tea and stuff like that is really, really important to know, especially if you have kind of these mushroom tools like this. This is highly, highly compressed, so that's important to note and to be aware of when you're choosing how much tea you want to brew.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's fun for me talking about these things because they're subtle, but they are noticeable, especially if you're doing a tea practice every day or enjoying tea and being attentive to it. You're going to realize some of these weird little things that make a difference, believe it or not.
Definitely.
Yeah. So it's kind of fun to talk about this stuff. And we should definitely do something like this again.
Absolutely. I think it's been really interesting, at least for myself and hopefully for you guys.
Cool. So for more tea musings and other information about tea, blog posts, history, photos, and lots of episodes of talking about great tea, check out TeaDB.org. Anything else?
No, but I think that wraps it up, and we'll see you guys soon.
Cheers.